The LZX Curtain is a wideband analog edge processor and filter. It's capable of a range of effects from blurring to edge extractions. While it's a relatively simple module, you can easily find a use for it in any patch, from creating more organic shapes to producing illusions of depth and generating different textures. So let's jump right into the basics and help you get started with your curtain. So I'm going to begin by taking an H+V ramp from my Cortex, and I'm going to use the doorway to generate a basic hard edge shape. I'm going to plug this into the molt on a bridge because I know I'm going to take it to multiple destinations. Let's just take a look at what that looks like. So we just have a basic hard-edged white circle. And now I'm going to go into the filter input on the curtain, and we're going to view the filter output. So this is showing me what my filter is doing. The curtain filter is a high-pass filter, which means that it looks for the highest frequency parts of the images, in most cases the edges, and extracts those. So as I adjust my width control, you can see it extracting more or less of that edge. There is a range switch, so this is set to the highest frequency range, so you're going to get very, very tight edges. Switch that into a lower range. This is a lower frequency range. And then the lowest range, it's going to very dramatically blur the image. I'll switch that into the middle position. So on the top here we have rectifier controls for our high-pass filter circuit. The image all the way on the left is our standard high-pass circuit. So you can see just the edges to the right of the image are being extracted. If I move it one over, we get a rectified version. And then we get just the positive edges, just the negative edges. So this gives you 4 different options. Below that we have a width control, which is a fine tune for the frequency. Let's see what that's doing. One of the very useful features of the curtain is that it also features a mixing section. So if I plug into the mix output, we'll start to see what this is doing. So in the middle here we have a depth control. And this basically switches the circuit to act as if it were a high-pass filter or a low-pass filter. And then we have an attenuverting mix control. So this is taking the filter signal and either adding it or subtracting it from the mix input. The mix input is normaled to the filter input, but we can also break that and plug in different types of shapes. So we have a built-in mixer for our filter control. Now, one of the most basic and useful functions of the curtain is to provide depth, shadows, and other textures to shapes you've already created. So let me show you a little bit of how that works. So I'm going to take my plain keyed output, go into one channel on my visual cortex. So that's just my regular shape. Then I'm going to take the filter output from curtain and plug that into the composite input. And so now you can see I'm able to add areas of shading to my circle. If I switch through the different rectifier options, you'll see that we can get shadows in different places, highlights in different places. As I adjust my width control, get different shading. I'm going to turn my mix on so we get some colors in here. There we go. So this is a very simple, basic effect. Notice that these mix controls aren't going to do anything, so I'm using just a filter output. But I can get different types of highlights, shadows, and depth. I can also voltage control the width here. So I just have a moving, scrolling horizontal bar, and you can see it's changing the width of that shadow. And what's nice with this setup is that the shadow is being applied separately from the RGB color information. So if this were a full color image here going into my RGB, I could still maintain that black shadow. This is one advantage of using the filter output as opposed to the mix output and compositing outside of the module. It allows you to use a single curtain to process shadows, depth, and shading on an RGB image. In this case, we're keying our source image before the curtain. I wanted to do this to show you how to get simple drop shadows and outlines. But another great way to use curtain is to process an image before keying. So I'm going to take that same source, go into my filter input, and I'm going to take the mix output here and put that into a keyer. In this case, I'm going to use the topogram. I'm going to just pull these out so they're not doing anything. And I'll take a few of these topogram outputs and plug them into some different RGB channels. And now you can see a very different effect. So remember, I'm still modulating my width voltage control. Adjust these. And even if I take this voltage control out, maybe you can see a little bit more clearly. As I start to filter that gradient image, it starts to give me these more organic, kind of wonky shapes to my key. And of course, I can control my mix. Let's put that back in. And if you want to take a look at what this looks like before hitting the topogram, just go like here. So you can see what's happening. Again, even without the width voltage control, it's taking this basic ramp and it's letting me blur it out in different directions. I can change the range controls. Let's put that back in. Take a look at it again over here. So as you can see, this module can play a really powerful role in pattern and shape creation. Let's look at a more specific example of that in the next patch. So in this patch, I'm going to start with some very basic bars. So here I'm using the Fortress to generate a series of vertical bars. And you'll notice that they're hard-edged square wave bars. I'm going to plug this straight into the filter input on the curtain. Let's take a look at this. So here you can see I can start to smush out the bars a little bit. I change the mix controls. So I can get this kind of scanning behavior almost. And if you look just at the filter output, see I'm just seeing those edges. This is pretty cool. So one fun thing I like to do is take the filter and mix outputs and combine them in different ways. So in this case, I'm going to plug both of them into an arch using the analog logic processor. And let's take a look at some of these different combinations. So here we can see the min. Turn that one up. You can see the max. Got the absolute, intersection, and clip. For this example, I think I'm going to stick with the max. I'm going to play with some different settings here. So you can see you're starting to get kind of an embossed effect. And we're just gaining a really nice way to modulate these vertical bars. So now I'm going to use the mix input, and I'm going to plug in another source. I'm going to plug in the horizontal ramp output from a diver, and this is just giving me a slow scanning bar. If I start to adjust these more, I'll see something that starts to resemble blinds gently blowing in the wind. If I want to add some color to this, I could take one of the ADC inputs on my Fortress, plug into there instead. And we'll go red, green, blue, out to red, green, blue, in. Start to turn that up. And let me switch to a different palette. There we go. That one's nice. So now my blinds are colored. And if I switch through different rectification options, different width and different ranges, I'll start to get different effects. If I switch from blur to sharpen, get something very nice and different. I can play with these mix controls. And then finally, I can introduce some more modulation. I'm going to go into the width control. One of the nice things is that you can use full video rate images to CV anything on this module. So go to the H+V input. So that's going to add a little bit more shape. I can adjust the range of my oscillator. Start to get some very interesting moving effects. And if I jump up to a higher range, I can get kind of tighter edges. And of course, by switching through different ramp shapes, I can get very different patterns. By switching through different palettes, I can start to get some really nice stuff going on. So that's just one example of how you can use a curtain to add additional complexity to your shape and pattern patches. It's a great way to take gradients and other shapes and add a little bit more complexity and modulation to them before further processing. In the next patch, we'll look at using curtain for image processing. So in this last patch, we're just going to play around with taking an external image and seeing some of the different things that curtain can do. So I'm going to take the Y output from my memory palace. I have just a very basic still. Nice black and white portrait. I'm using a still instead of an external video so that it's clearer to see what the curtain is doing, but obviously this effect would work great on an external video input. So I'm going to put this back into the filter input of my curtain. And to begin, let's just take a look at the filter output so we can see what the filter itself is doing. So I'm going to set this all the way to the left. And if I play with my different width controls, you could start to see an effect pretty similar to what we were seeing before with shapes. So if you set it just right, you get this kind of outline extraction. And if you switch through your different rectifier sections, you'll see it starting to highlight different parts of the image. And we could switch again to different ranges. We have our highest range, just a very slight edge, all the way to our lowest range, which is going to create just basically a overwhelming blur. So I'll keep that set over there. Now let's go to our mix outputs. And again, you can see if I move to the blur direction, if I move to sharp, we're getting low pass or high pass filtering effects mixed in. Curtain is capable of a very useful range of basic image processing techniques. I'm going to take this output into a mult. We're going to start pulling it into some different directions. And let's take a look again at some of the things we can do with an arch. So I'm going to take the original into the arch input. And I'm going to take the filtered output back into there as well. I've got to remember to plug something into the filter again. There we go. So instead of looking at the mix output, let's take a look at some of the different arch outputs. So now that we're seeing the logical minimum of the original image and the filtered image, we could start to extract those edges a little bit more precisely. Get some very cool outline effects. You can also switch to the max. Just going to give a pretty subtle effect. And the absolute, etc. So this gives us another very cool way to start processing our image. If we go into some kind of colorizer, in this case I'm just going to use the colorizer on the visual cortex, you start to see a whole new range of pretty cool possibilities. So we can get just these slightly shifting edges. Again, we can use something to modulate the width. So I might just go into my diver. Start to get these kind of scanning effects. Get it pretty wiggly. And just for fun, I can make this a little bit more complex, plugging it into a staircase. Let me slow it down just a little bit. Generate some different phase controls. And so this is pretty cool because it gives you a totally analog way to start distorting an image without using a digital tool such as the Memory Palace. If I wanted to, I could switch this to the mix output and start to sum something else into that signal within the curtain. So now I can start playing with my mix effects. So in addition to the image distorting, we can also get a corresponding color modulation. Having this built-in mixer is extremely useful, as you can see, for a variety of reasons. And again, we can experiment with different ranges, so we can get a little bit more or less of that frequency modulation. Different rectifier settings, etc. And then finally, since we do have this still on the Memory Palace, we can start animating it. And scanning through it. This will give you a little bit more of an idea of what might be possible with external video input, since we have in this case a moving source. So that should give you some idea of how to get started using your curtain. One great thing about this module is that you can really use it almost anywhere in a patch to add a little extra depth and dimension to what you're working on. I'd encourage you to experiment wildly with trying it in different parts of your patch. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.